More than 8,000 service members discharged, careers interrupted, benefits affected, all because they refused one vaccine. And now, 3 years later, the Department of the Navy has issued a formal letter of apology. Under Secretary Hung Chow appeared in a video message that's already generating millions of views across social media. His words were blunt.
To the sailors and Marines who were wrongfully discharged during COVID, we failed you. We will never allow this to happen again, not on my watch. We are ready for you to come back, and we want to correct your records. You are warriors of conscience, and we need people like you back in the force to accomplish peace through strength. We're righting this wrong, and it starts with this formal letter of apology. Semper Fi et Huya.
That's not standard Pentagon language, that's an admission. But here's where it gets interesting. The apology comes with an offer. Come back, get your rank restored, receive back pay. The question everyone's asking is why now? And the answer depends entirely on which version of this story you're hearing. Because on this issue, the gap between left-leaning and right-leaning coverage isn't just wide, it's significant. I'm Claire Morgan, and this is the Mirror Moment Podcast. Let's establish what we know for certain. On August 24th, 2021, Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin mandated that all service members receive the COVID-19 vaccine. The mandate applied across every branch: active duty, National Guard, reserves, no exceptions beyond approved medical or religious exemptions. According to the Department of Veterans Affairs, more than 8,000 service members were separated from the military because they refused to comply with this mandate. Fox News reports that over 70% of those discharged received general discharges rather than honorable discharges, a distinction that affected their eligibility for certain veterans' benefits, including GI Bill education assistance. The mandate remained in effect until January 10th, 2023, when it was rescinded as part of the National Defense Authorization Act. CNN confirmed that then Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin officially rescinded the mandate in a memo stating that Section 525 of the NDAA for fiscal year 2023 required him to rescind the vaccination requirement he had issued in his August 2021 memorandum. Here's what happened after the mandate was lifted. According to CNN's October 2023 reporting, only 43 of the more than 8,000 service members who were discharged sought to rejoin the military in the 8 months following the repeal. That's less than half of 1%. Military.com reported similar numbers. 19 soldiers returned to the Army, 12 to the Marines. The Navy and Air Force saw even fewer, which raises an obvious question. If the discharges were so unjust, why didn't more people come back when they had the chance? We'll come back to that question, because the answer might tell us something important about what really happened here. Fast forward to January 2025. President Trump signed Executive Order 14184 shortly after his inauguration. The order directs federal agencies to identify service members affected by the former vaccine requirement and take steps to reinstate them or restore certain benefits. The White House website states that the vaccine mandate was an unfair, overbroad, and completely unnecessary burden on service members, and that the military unjustly discharged those who refused the vaccine regardless of the years of service given to the nation after failing to grant many of them an exemption that they should have received. The order applies to former members of all military branches who were discharged solely for refusing the COVID-19 vaccine. It enables those reinstated to revert to their former rank and receive full back pay, benefits, bonus payments, or compensation. Then, in April 2025, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth issued guidance directing a proactive review of personnel records. Stars and Stripes reports that approximately 8,700 service members were involuntarily separated for not complying with his mandate, and more than 3,000 of them did not receive honorable discharges. According to the December guidance, the military services will create validated lists of individuals eligible for review, then refer those cases to discharge review boards, which must issue decisions to every individual within 1 calendar year. Former service members don't need to do anything. The review is automatic. And that brings us to Friday, January 24th, 2026. The Department of the Navy issued its formal apology letter. Under Secretary Hung Chow, a retired Navy captain who himself opposed the vaccine mandate during his Senate campaign, delivered the message in a video posted to social media. "We are righting this wrong, and it starts with this formal letter of apology," Chow stated. Fox News reports that Chow emphasized the department is committed to righting past wrongs and welcoming back former service members who were dismissed during the pandemic, saying the Navy is ready for them to come back and wants to correct their records. So those are the confirmed facts. A mandate was issued. 8,000 people were discharged. The mandate was rescinded. An executive order was signed. An apology was issued. Reinstatement is being offered. Now let's look at how different outlets are framing what this actually means. On the right, the narrative is straightforward and emotionally charged. This was government overreach, a violation of conscience, a mandate critics consider unlawful that targeted healthy warriors and harmed our military. Fox News coverage emphasizes Secretary Hegseth's December memo stating it is unconscionable that thousands of former service members who held true to their personal and religious convictions were not just separated, but separated with general under honorable conditions rather than honorable discharge characterizations. The Daily Wire reported extensively on the Army sending letters to soldiers fired under Biden's COVID vaccine mandate and called the repeal a victory for the military and common sense. Breitbart characterized the situation as the Army scrambling to get back soldiers it kicked out over Biden's vaccine mandate and described Republican concerns about 100,000 troops facing discharge. Newsmax covered the mandate repeal as a major GOP victory and highlighted calls from military leaders to hold Biden administration officials accountable. The Wall Street Journal editorial board has been referenced by lawmakers as calling Biden's vaccine mandate a dubious reach of federal power. Gateway Pundit and other conservative outlets are using language like experimental vaccine and unlawful mandate in their headlines. InfoWars describes Hegseth's action as redemption for the personnel discharged under the vaccine mandate. The right-leaning frame is clear. This was about freedom of conscience, religious liberty, government overreach, and now justice is being served. The left tells a completely different story. Or rather, the left told a completely different story when the mandate was being implemented and debated. MSNBC's coverage in December 2022 called removing the military's COVID vaccine mandate a bad look that doesn't just endanger service members, but sends a bad signal to the rest of the world. MSNBC columnist Ryan Cooper wrote that nixing the mandate was proof positive that leaders hoping to spread dangerous conspiracy theories in the military can make it happen, arguing that Republicans effectively used the military to signal their allegiance to right-wing conspiracy theories amplified by foreign governments seeking to meddle in American affairs. NBC News reported in December 2022 that some military officials were concerned the case could provide a roadmap for disgruntled troops to protest in the future, giving them proof they can lobby Congress and get a lawful order overturned, even if military leaders and the Secretary of Defense disagree. CNN's reporting emphasizes that Defense Secretary Austin mandated the vaccine after it received FDA approval, and that the COVID-19 vaccine is one of more than 15 vaccines required by the Defense Department. CNN also noted that while Republicans argued the mandate hurt recruitment and retention, Pentagon officials maintained there was no evidence to support that claim, and that all military services had surpassed their retention goals for the first 10 months of fiscal year 2023, even as they faced recruiting challenges. The Atlantic and New Yorker coverage has focused on the precedent this sets for military discipline. If soldiers can refuse vaccines because of misinformation, the argument goes, what about other required vaccines for adenovirus, influenza, measles, polio? NBC highlighted that at least 317 military members, contractors, civilian employees, or family members reportedly died of COVID and questioned whether this decision could lead to more deaths. The left-leaning frame was clear. This was about following lawful orders, protecting force readiness, public health. Political interference was undermining military discipline and setting a dangerous precedent. That was the frame when the mandate existed and when it was repealed. But now that the Navy has issued a formal apology and reinstatement offer, as of this recording, there is no coverage from CNN, MSNBC, The Washington Post, The New York Times, NPR, or The Guardian. Not one article, not one segment. The story exists in conservative media. It does not exist in left-leaning media. And that absence is itself the story. Here's what's fascinating. Both sides are using the exact same data points to reach opposite conclusions. The number 8,000. Is that proof the mandate was draconian and unjust? Or is it 1.5% of active duty forces, a relatively small number given the politicization of the issue? The fact that only 43 people came back after the mandate was lifted, does that prove the discharged service members moved on with their lives and never really wanted to serve anyway? Or does it show how difficult it was to return after receiving a non-honorable discharge classification with gaps on your resume that would be hard to explain to a promotion board? The religious exemption requests. Fox News and conservative outlets emphasized that thousands requested exemptions and almost none were granted, suggesting the process was a sham. CNN and NBC counter that service members are required to receive more than a dozen vaccines as part of normal onboarding. So why was this vaccine different? The left says politics and misinformation. The right says conscience and bodily autonomy. But here's the part that should stop you cold. We're not just seeing different opinions about whether the mandate was good policy. We're seeing a complete coverage blackout on one side. When the mandate was being debated in 2022, left-leaning outlets covered it extensively. MSNBC called the repeal dangerous. CNN reported on military readiness concerns. The Atlantic and New Yorker wrote about the precedent for discipline. But now that the Navy has issued a formal apology, silence. Complete radio silence from major left-leaning outlets. No CNN article examining whether the apology is justified. No MSNBC segment questioning the precedent this sets. No Washington Post analysis of what this means for military authority. No NPR interview with discharged service members about how they feel. The story simply doesn't exist in that media ecosystem. And that's not an editorial choice about how to frame a story. That's a choice about whether to acknowledge a story exists at all. Think about the implications. If you're a discharged service member who reads the New York Times every morning, you might not even know the Navy apologized to you. If you're a military family that watches CNN, you have no idea. Your government just admitted it failed these people. If you're a voter trying to understand what's happening with military policy and you rely on NPR, this entire development is invisible to you. And if you're someone who gets news from Fox and conservative outlets, you're watching what feels like a massive vindication unfold in real time. A government admission of wrongdoing, a formal apology, reinstatement offers, back pay, the whole thing. But mention it to your friend who only reads the Washington Post and they'll look at you like you're making it up. Because in their information universe, it never happened. This is what information silos look like at scale. Not just different spins on the same story, different realities entirely. One side is experiencing a major government apology and policy reversal. The other side is experiencing a normal day in February, and both groups think they're informed. But here's where it gets truly remarkable. And this is the actual mirror moment. There is zero standalone coverage from CNN, MSNBC, The Washington Post, The New York Times, NPR, or The Guardian. Not a single article, not a news segment, not even a brief. The story doesn't exist in left-leaning media spaces. Think about what that means. If you consume news primarily from Fox, Newsmax, The Daily Wire, you've seen extensive coverage of this apology. You've seen Cow's video. You've read about the formal letter. You know the Navy said we failed you. But if you get your news from CNN or MSNBC or NPR, you have no idea this happened. You didn't see the apology. You don't know about the letter. The story simply isn't part of your reality. This isn't different framing of the same event. This is one half of the country experiencing a significant policy development, while the other half experiences nothing at all. One ecosystem is covering a formal government apology to 8,000 service members. The other ecosystem has moved on to other stories entirely. This is the mirror moment. The point where you realize we're not having a disagreement about the same set of facts. We're not even looking at the same facts. Half the country is watching a story unfold. The other half doesn't know the story exists. And the evidence gap is real. Here's what we don't know. We don't know how many of the 8,000 service members requested religious exemptions that were denied. The reporting varies. We don't know how many had legitimate medical concerns versus political objections. We don't know whether the exemption process was genuinely rigorous or if it was designed to fail. We don't have clear data on whether the discharges actually harmed military readiness or whether retention goals being met proves they didn't. We don't know if the 43 who came back represent the total number who wanted to return or if others faced barriers we're not seeing. Most importantly, we don't know whether this reinstatement policy will actually work. Will thousands take the offer? Or will it be dozens? And what does that tell us about the original narrative? The Department of Veterans Affairs announced in November 2025 that nearly 900 of the discharged veterans have been found eligible for GI Bill education benefits after discharge upgrades, with thousands more who could also regain eligibility. The Hill reports that the VA sent letters in September to veterans who have already received upgraded discharges to inform them of their potential eligibility. But as of this recording, we don't have comprehensive data on how many of the 8,000 have actually applied for reinstatement under the new policy. We don't know the breakdown by branch, by reason for refusal, by years of service. That data exists somewhere, but it's not being widely reported. And that absence matters, because without it, both narratives can continue unchallenged. Here's what makes this story different from typical partisan divides. This isn't about taxes or trade policy where reasonable people can disagree about the best approach. This is about whether the government has the authority to require medical interventions as a condition of military service. And that question sits at the intersection of about 6 different fault lines: personal liberty versus collective security, religious freedom versus military discipline, individual conscience versus institutional authority, federal power versus state sovereignty, medical autonomy versus public health, and trust in institutions versus skepticism of government overreach. Every single one of those fault lines runs hot right now, which means this story isn't really about a vaccine mandate. It's about who gets to decide what's true, who has authority, who deserves trust, whether institutions that make mistakes can be reformed or whether they need to be torn down and rebuilt. And that's why the framing gap matters so much. If you consume primarily right-leaning media, you've been told a story about patriots who stood up to tyranny, lost everything, and are finally getting justice. If you consume primarily left-leaning media, you've been told a story about politicized service members who disobeyed orders, undermined readiness, and are now being rewarded for it. Both stories can't be fully true, but elements of both might be. And we won't know which elements until we get answers to questions that aren't being asked loudly enough. Questions like, what was the actual approval rate for religious exemptions across different branches? Were there differences in how exemption requests were evaluated? What happened to service members who had documented adverse reactions to other vaccines but were still required to get this one? How many of the discharged had 20-plus years of service versus how many were newer recruits? What's the demographic breakdown? Did certain communities or belief systems face higher discharge rates? Most importantly, now that reinstatement is offered with back pay and rank restoration, will the numbers tell us this was a small group making a political statement, or a large group facing genuine conscience conflicts? The Navy's apology letter is real, the offer is real, the 8,000 discharges are real. But the meaning of those facts, that's still being written. And it's being written differently depending on where you get your news. So here's what I'm watching for. First, the actual reinstatement numbers. If thousands come back, that suggests the original discharges were seen as inappropriate by those affected and they're willing to return to service. If only hundreds come back, that raises questions about whether this was really about serving versus making a point. Second, the legal challenges. Are there lawsuits coming from service members who complied with the mandate who now argue they were coerced? Third, the precedent. What happens the next time there's a health emergency and the military needs to mandate a vaccine? Will troops now feel empowered to refuse? And fourth, the political fallout. This policy shift is happening under a Trump administration. What happens if there's another administration change? Do we reverse the reversal? What we're watching is bigger than vaccine policy. We're watching a test case for whether institutions can change course, admit error, and rebuild trust, or whether every policy shift becomes ammunition in an endless culture war where the goal isn't truth or justice, but total victory over the other side. But more than that, we're watching what happens when half the media ecosystem decides a story isn't worth covering. When a formal government apology to 8,000 people becomes newsworthy on one side and invisible on the other. The mirror moment isn't about picking sides. It's about recognizing when we've stopped looking at the same reality. When two people can live in the same country, both trying to stay informed, and one knows about a major military policy development while the other has never heard of it. When the same executive order is described as righting wrongs by outlets that cover it and doesn't exist at all in outlets that don't. When coverage itself becomes the story because the absence of coverage reveals just how fractured our information landscape has become. If this episode made you think, hit the like button. If it made you uncomfortable, that probably means it's working. Drop a comment and tell me what I missed. What questions should we be asking that we're not? And here's a challenge. If you found out about this Navy apology from this episode, ask yourself where else you get your news and why they didn't tell you about it. If you already knew about it, ask yourself whether the people you disagree with politically even know it happened. And subscribe because we're going to keep following this story as the reinstatement numbers come in and as we see whether this coverage gap closes or widens. This isn't over. It's just beginning. The mirror moment happens when you realize the story you're hearing might not be the only story that's true. But the deeper mirror moment happens when you realize that half the country isn't hearing the story at all. And that realization, that's where the real conversation has to start. I'm Claire Morgan. Stay curious, stay skeptical, and most importantly, stay willing to question everything. Even the narrative you want to believe, especially which stories you're being told. And, critically, which stories you're not being told at all.